Okay, so this is the T-3485, the late war version. Turret formation process. So we're going to form its basic shape. One thing you want to start with is just make sure that this bottom part is nice and flat. And then overfold all these angles so it can just sort of sit in the position that you want it to without too much pressure on the patches. Then we're going to take a skewer and we're going to round this side part. And most of the rounding for the top takes place right where these three solid red lines are. And then there's a little bit of rounding all the way along here, but it's more towards the bottom than the top. You can kind of see the whole bottom is rounded. So even over here where it's flat on the top, you have to round this a little bit to get it to sit in exactly the right position. So the bottom should be fairly rounded fairly evenly, but the top needs most of it to happen in this area here. So you can see that's kind of holding the right shape. And you also want to make sure that the top of the turret is flat. Like this part will be held in place by these angles, but this front part can sometimes be a little bit off. So just make sure that it's right. And we do the rounding for both sides. So I just use the skewer to kind of, because if you do it all with your fingers, it's kind of easy to miss some areas. And just rolling the bamboo skewer evens out the rounding effect better than just using your fingers the whole time. Once you've got it started to round, it's a little bit easier to actually use your fingers. So you can see that's kind of just sitting in the position that it's going to need to. Or you can over round things, it kind of helps even a bit. So this front part also has to be rounded, and can almost guarantee you're going to have de-lamination. Generally it starts from here. So if you have a couple of mini clothespins, you can slip some glue under here. We'll see if it happens here to me. It almost always does, just because you have to work this piece quite a bit. May have already actually glued that down a bit. It's starting to lift off. There we go. Okay, so the best thing to do is actually just pull it right off, or back a bit, like this. And then take some 2-to-1 or 4-to-1 glue. I'm going to use 4-to-1 because I want this to dry fairly quickly so we can move on to the next step. We're just going to slip that under there. Bond that back together. Just set these on for a second to make sure that the bond takes place nicely. And that won't take long at all to set in place. So this part here, when we do close this down, you're going to want to have this whole dotted line here, which actually isn't a score line. It just shows how much of that is hidden. So you can see that if you hide that whole dotted line, there's a little bit of, like it doesn't evenly shrink in size if this is all hidden. There's a bit of a jump down here. You want that. So in just a moment I'll pull these off. This should be set enough to continue. Okay. So you want to glue it like that. And again, we're just going to throw some glue on here. We're going to use these exact same two clothespins we just used a moment ago to hold it in place once we have it where we want it. So kind of fold these back out of your way a bit. Get it in a position where you can kind of hold it with a finger on one side. Make sure you're covering just enough and that the drop down is equal on both sides. And then lock it in place for a moment with those. So you don't want to add the turret neck until after this is all glued together. And the reason for that is that the turret neck is useful for placing part of the rear of the chassis on. If it's independent from the turret, it's fine to use still to place the chassis back part on. And also that when you have your patches and you're folding your patches down, the turret neck gets in the way, so it's best to wait and attach it later. So this should be pretty much set now, I would hope. You actually start with the T3485. You start on the back and work it towards the front. So we can actually start that now while this is gluing. So we're going to glue this angle on the bottom. So if you make sure that this here corner meets up really nicely so that the sides aren't really overlapping too much, either one, but they just come to either one pretty much evenly. And we'll put a patch here and along the bottom to hold that in place. We just trim these off later once the shape is formed and they're dry. We should be able to pull these off now. I'll make the rest of this a little bit easier. So we just want to meet that up nicely in the corner again and do the other side. And it's a little bit easier to do them with glue on both to start. And you can also do the trick where you use this. If there's a bit of a gap, you can pull the side in and then push it down. And it kind of pulls the side of the turret in down towards the bottom where you want it. Okay, so what these are supposed to do is fit under the top part. And go. So you may have to round these a little bit. I think I unrounded them when I was doing the front. And they're supposed to sit underneath. Just like this. So that's why that overhang is there. The side of the turret actually goes and tucks underneath it, like that. So So if you can press it down on the top to hold it in place here. And then just slip a patch over the front and this to hold that nicely in place. So you want a small patch. And then just maintain that for a moment. Turn it over. I'm going to glue this to down here to complete the shape. Should be able to let side go. Alright, now I'm just going to do the same thing to the other side. So it may take some effort to kind of get this into position. And let's re-round the front here so it sits where it needs to be. A little bit easier. Kind of fit the front in under the top and on top of the bottom. You can see the bottom of the turret is visible all along here. And then you might need to modify the shape of the front of the turret a little bit to get it to follow this curve. You can just kind of squash it into place. And once you have your thing nicely in position, try to hold it there tightly by putting pressure, down pressure on here and up pressure on the bottom. And make sure you got a nice small patch ready to go. Just want to set this side, which is already pretty much holding the form we want it to. If there's any extra overhang along here, you probably want to trim that off, but let things dry before you start doing that. And then trim them flush with the line of the turret. But that forms your basic T-34-85 turret shape.